Hello, I think we are live now. Unfortunately, Jeff is not able to connect at the moment, but we hope he will join later. He has got a technical problem at the moment, I think. We are starting now. My name is Emre Kızılkaya. I'm a vice chair of the Vienna-based International Press Institute and IPI's Turkey National Committee chair. I'm also an editor of journal.com.tr. And here today, we will be discussing democratizing algorithms for news in fragile democracies with our panelists. Supriya Sharma is the executive editor of Scrolling in India, and Jeffrey Horwitz, technology reporter of Wall Street Journal, Alexandria Walden, global head of human rights at Google, and Urška Umek, head of media unit at Council of Europe. I will give some more detailed information about panelists later, but let's first hear about the background of this panel. Well-informed public decisions play a vital role in combating democratic backsliding in hybrid regimes, as repressive governments exercise uncontested power over access to information and its instruments. And are digital platforms more responsive to the issue of algorithmic distortion in developed countries, while they often disregard the problem in developing countries where human rights and press freedom are even more vulnerable? Is it even possible for these multinational corporations to safeguard free speech and quality journalism at a global scale, not only in the West, not only in the US or Europe, but every country, while the threats and challenges are often local and even hyper-local? And to answer these questions in this IPI-hosted RightsCon panel, we bring together journalists from India, the United States, Turkey, and with an executive of Google and an expert from the Council of Europe. With this conversation, we hope to learn from these experts through examples from different media landscapes, media environments, and map out solutions together with global digital platforms. We hope to kindle the spark of a coalition between the providers and distributors of quality journalism and to set standards on how algorithms should treat news content in fragile democracies. Supriya Sharma began her journalism career at the Mumbai reporting team of NDTV, India's leading television broadcaster. She worked for the Times of India, the most widely read English newspaper in the country, as a special correspondent, investigating conflicts and human rights issues that challenge the Indian democracy. She is currently the executive editor of Scroll.in. Scroll is the digital-only news organization with the widest reach in English language media in India. Jeff Horwitz is a technology reporter for the Wall Street Journal, as you probably know if you are following technology news, based in San Francisco, where he covers Facebook's business and its impact on the world. His reporting has won repeated recognition, including a Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing Award, a General Loeb Awards finalist citation for the articles he produced with two colleagues about Facebook's struggle to police hate in India. And previously he was a financial and enterprise reporter for the AP, Associated Press in Washington, D.C., where his work also won several awards. And Alex Walden is the global policy lead for human rights and free expression at Google. She's responsible for coordinating and driving the company-wide human rights strategy using approaches grounded in business and human rights. Based in Washington, D.C. also, Walden coordinates policy and strategy on a broad portfolio of issues, including human rights, freedom of expression, and controversial content, including hate and harassment. Prior to joining Google, her work focused on civil rights, women's rights, criminal justice reform, transparency, and judicial issues. And Urška Umek is the head of media unit at the secretary of MSI-RES, which is the Committee of Experts on Increasing Resilience of the Media at the Information Society Department of the Council of Europe. The organization produced a guidance note last year dealing with the prioritization of public interest content online, including quality journalism, and they laid down standards in a number of related fields, including the obligations of digital platforms from a regulatory governance perspective. So each panelist is actually working on related fields. And I am as I say, I represent the IPI, and in the past, for more than 15 years, I worked for Turkey's biggest newspaper, Hürriyet, in various roles, including the digital content. I spent time as a night visiting Nieman Fellow at Harvard 3 years ago. And currently I'm also studying trust in an academic way, trust in digital media as a PhD researcher at Galatasaray University in Istanbul. In this panel, please feel free to share your thoughts, share your comments in this chat box, and also your questions to our panelists here. And without waiting until the end of this session, I will try to ask all questions. In the first part, I will ask one question to each participant here, and then in the second half, we hope to have a more lively debate. So, but before that, we would like to learn about your opinion. Before we start, we will have 3 questions for the audience, 3 poll questions for the audience, and the first poll question we will have now, the second one in the middle, and the third one near the end of the session. So the first question is for you, the audience members. The big tech companies have a public duty to fight disinformation on their platforms. Do you agree with this statement or not? Do you think that the big tech companies have a public duty to fight disinformation on their platforms or not? Now, with this, as the poll results will come, let's start with Supriya. Supriya, you've been a journalist in India for almost 20 years. And when we are talking about fragile democracies in the headline of this, in the title of this panel, we are talking about actually lots of different countries. Like it's different in Hungary, it's different in Poland, Mexico, in Indonesia. Today, we will focus on India and Turkey in particular, which are really different environments, but which are both fragile democracies. And you've been a journalist for almost 20 years there. As a reporter, you have covered democratic elections, violent conflicts, climate crisis, healthcare, education systems, and gender justice. And in an interview for the Report for the World last year, you cited a new story that demonstrates the importance of a free press in India. It was a Scroll investigation about the police probe into violent protests across India following the controversial citizenship law. Now I will ask a related but more specific question. Can you give us some examples in which digital platforms affected, positively or negatively, the public life in India vis-a-vis news stories or newsworthy events that they are serving to their audiences on their platforms?
Well, first of all, thank you, Emre, for having me on this panel. This is really a very important topic because these opaque algorithms are completely reshaping media and politics in countries like mine. Before I answer your specific question, if you may allow me, I'd like to lay out the larger context in which digital platforms are affecting public life in India. As you mentioned, India is now a fragile democracy, but for the longest time, India took a lot of pride in being the world's largest democracy. However, in recent years, as we know, democratic freedoms, including freedom of press as well as religious freedoms, have significantly eroded in India, as has been documented extensively by various independent organizations. Now, what this means is that large sections of the mainstream news media in India, particularly television news, has become an echo chamber for establishment voices at best, and disseminator of hate and propaganda at worst. As a result, it's often up to independent media to do the vital job of holding power to account and debunking, these false and hateful narratives. Now, as you know, independent media is small. It's entirely at the mercy of digital platforms to reach its audience. And there it is true that some years ago, small news organizations like ours, the one that I work at, Scroll, digital platforms enabled us to build an audience in a very short time and to grow the audience. But what we're seeing now in recent years is that we're being choked. Every single small independent newsroom that I know of in India, and this is not just Scroll, as I said, virtually across the board, all small independent newsrooms, find their online traffic, kind of like ebb and flow in mysterious ways that has nothing to do with the quality of work that they publish or the volume of work that they publish. So essentially, we are, as I said, at the mercy of digital platforms, and we have no insight into the way that they are affecting our ability to distribute our work out there. And this isn't just true of small news organizations. In fact, these online algorithms, entirely opaque, they are setting up perverse incentives for news organizations at large. Essentially, what it means is that to grow your traffic, you must follow trending topics and hashtags that, as we know, are often created by political actors to deliberately distort the public conversation around vital issues, to serve distractions to the public, basically to evade scrutiny. And again, at Scroll, as you mentioned, we are a digital-only news organization. We are fiercely independent. We're committed to doing ground reporting and investigations, apart from, of course, providing a factually rigorous and fair account of the news. But we find that we are at a disadvantage because we are not following these trending topics and hashtags, because we can see through them. We know that they are being deliberately created. Basically, these are disinformation devices. We ignore them, but we pay a price for that, because that means that we're losing out on traffic, which impacts ad revenues, which in turn limits the resources available to us to do our job. Now, to come back to the specific question that you asked, well, I'll connect it with the news event that you mentioned. In December 2019, India saw these massive street protests against the citizenship law. This was a law that was passed, which for the very first time introduced a religious criteria for Indian citizenship. It provoked these massive protests by Indians who believe in the secular values of the country, as well as Muslims who felt that this was discriminatory towards them and aimed at harassing them. One of the most iconic protest sites was in Delhi, the city that I live in a neighborhood called Shaheen Bagh, where essentially Muslim women came out on the road to register their protest. They sat on the road, and they sat there not just for a day, but for days, weeks, actually 2 months. And initially, the mainstream media completely ignored their protests. But as conversation grew on social media, it became increasingly difficult for the news to ignore them. And therefore, in a way, social media, which is digital platforms, actually gave the protesters a microphone. It amplified their voices. It also created a sense of solidarity and community. Protesters in different cities, different parts of the country were taking inspiration from each other. And so it set off a major civil rights movement, if I may call it that. However, the same digital platforms then also enabled the ruling party of India and its affiliates to spread a lot of hate and propaganda against the protesters. So a minister of the central government in India actually delivered a speech where he asked for the protesters to be shot. And this speech, of course, was all over the internet. And before Facebook could take it down, it had been viewed by millions. And well, soon enough, there was a young man at one of the protest sites who showed up with a gun, and he shot a student protester. Despite all of this, in the weeks that followed, hateful speeches continued to circulate, continued to be amplified on digital platforms. And in a matter of time, we had actual violence break out in Delhi. There were riots, and 53 people were killed in those riots. So this entire episode showed the power of digital platforms in India. And it's like this enormous influence that the digital platforms are having on the public sphere. And they aren't accountable to anyone other than authoritarian governments, which is something that is a matter of great concern to anyone who cares for democracy.
Thank you, Supriya. As you said, actually briefly mentioned, it reminded me of Jeff's recent tweet by Jeff. He was saying the overall effect of a platform is unknowable. It's the composite of design choices, which might range from good to awful. is using Facebook bad, is as uselessly broad as it is it unhealthy to live in cities. So these very big platforms with so many different algorithms and data points, etc. And they're, for instance, you cannot compare Facebook with Google in many ways. They are so different, the products, etc. So I will, from here, I will turn to Jeff and would like to continue with India here. And I think Jeff is able to join us with audio only. Jeff, you won multiple journalism awards after you reported with two colleagues about Facebook's struggle to police hate in India too. I know well that the revelations in the Facebook files go well beyond this country, but starting from the situation in India, can you give us a glimpse of the big picture in this context? Now you are, by the way, writing a book on how this company, through its algorithms and decision-making, affects human behavior and society. So would you like to tell something about this?
Absolutely, and my apologies for having been very optimistic about my Wi-Fi connection this morning. I think yes, the sort of the history of building these products didn't really take into account many of the things that I think most of the people on this call think. I would say that it's obviously engagement has always been the primary goal. The design of platforms like Facebook, and I mean, you mentioned Google being different. YouTube is, I think, in many ways more similar than different. These were not sort of built with much in the way of either safety features. Or even necessarily thinking about how to deal with crises like everything extremely ad hoc in terms of response. And I think something that is very much worth remembering is just the editorial choices, right? The platforms are in terms of what content to promote. They're just doing it in an entirely automated fashion, and that is sort of being applied in a very broad sense here.
Just a follow-up question, Jeff. What was the most striking finding in your research so far into Facebook's practice, from all the interviews that you had, like dozens of interviews with their former employees and current employees, plus all the internal documents that you saw? What was the most striking related to this panel's topic?
Honestly, I think it's how long it took before the company even had the tools to even start thinking about the things that the people on this panel are concerned with. Facebook was still basically building up a panel of metrics to answer questions about whether essentially discourse on the platform is overheating. They were building those up in 2019, like late 2019. That was the first time they sort of had what they call a guardrail metric, a full set of guardrail metrics for integrity work. So I think it's, I think a big part of thinking about this stuff is just understanding that while there are some really smart people, this stuff is deeply remedial still. I actually want to call out Facebook. I would suspect that they have invested more heavily in understanding their platform and thinking about interventions for when their platform overheats, shall we say, than any of their competitors. So I suspect that, unfortunately, I was looking at the best-in-class breed for this stuff.
Thank you. And by the way, the first poll question, audience poll questions answer came. We had asked whether the big tech companies have a public duty to fight disinformation on their platforms, and by a ratio of 12 to 1, people say yes. So people expect, at least the vast majority expects tech companies to fight disinformation. And from here we can come to Google, to Alex. And before becoming the global policy lead for human rights and free expression at Google, you spent many years in NGOs advocating for civil rights and improving policies and legal frameworks affecting these issues. So you know both sides very well, the private sector and the third sector. Do you think can a global company, which is motivated by profit, naturally serve the public interest too? And how does Google see its role vis-a-vis human rights and free expression in the face of so much criticism in so many fields and markets across the world?
Thanks for that question, and thanks for inviting us to participate in the conversation today. I think to the first part of your question, yes, global companies can serve the public interest. There are so many examples that remind us continually that democratic progress is not inevitable and that democracy and rules-based order are not guaranteed. You know, we see that also even in the research, you know, from Freedom House that has shown us that all of the defining features of democracy, free expression, open debate, association, and rule of law, that's retreating in many countries around the world. At the same time, for us as a company, democracy has always been a fertile ground for innovation and research. And so for us, it's important to be in space, like for companies, it's important that democratic values and openness and pluralism, those things allow for scientific inquiry to flourish. And that's important for us as a business. And so that's just to underscore that what's important, what's good for us as a business is also exactly what's important for people, for citizens, for us in the human rights community, for folks in the journalism community, for policymakers, that we all do have sort of a shared interest in maintaining and preserving openness. And that doesn't mean that it's easy, but I do certainly, to your point, I think, or to your question, I do think it is possible for companies to do that. And I think we're aligned in that interest. But to the second part of your question, how we think about our role related to human rights, I think for Google, for many companies, but in particular for Google, we really do need to be grounded in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And that should be the foundation for how we think about what our role is vis-a-vis other stakeholders, governments, civil society, multilateral, multi-stakeholder organizations. But the UN guiding principles really help ground us in thinking about what our responsibilities are. And so I think what that really does is help us focus on ensuring that companies, especially large companies, are taking a systematic approach to how we think about what our salient human rights are, and ensuring that we are embedding our thinking around human rights throughout the company. And so that should manifest as high-level approaches and then more specific policies and features for each product. And then, of course, that feeds into how we test our products and how we have feedback loops around what users' experience is and how we understand outcomes to be working across our various products. Another important piece of that is related to transparency. And I think that's something we have long been committed to. And of course, there's a lot of conversation happening amongst this RightsCon community and outside of it about what more transparency looks like and how can companies be transparent in a way that helps our varieties of stakeholders understand how our products are working, why people are receiving particular results, whether that's on YouTube or in ads or in search, to help them make the best decisions for how they're interacting with our products. So that's just one important place for us to be, I think, focused, and what it means for companies to think about human rights. Transparency is a key piece of that. Another is about stakeholder engagement. And obviously, like I said, we have many stakeholder groups. Certainly journalists are one part of that. Human rights defenders are another, and then sort of all sorts of other categories of users. And companies should be, and we are, investing in how we engage with those stakeholders to make sure we're understanding how our policies continue to impact those groups. And as you know, the sort of operating environments where we serve our users are constantly changing. And so we have to always be like, that's an ongoing process for us. And then lastly, another piece of that is about supporting the ecosystem. So that's NGOs, and that's also supporting the journalism ecosystem as well. So both of those things are kind of another part of how we think about broadly how we meet our obligations related to human rights. But I'll stop there and kick it back to you.
Thank you. And after the views from journalists and then Google's an executive of Google from the platform side, now we can turn perhaps to the regulation. And because I remember two things. Last year we had talks with, especially with the GNI umbrella organization as well. But apart from that too, we had contacts with the representatives of big global tech platforms, with many of them. One of them had said that, well, we are so big that he had actually quoted President Obama's speech. He had once said that America is so big that whatever I do, the effect will be seen only 5 years after I did it. It's like a big ship, a transatlantic ship. So they were making the same, using the same metaphor for their platforms as well. It's too big to change so quickly for the good. And another one was saying that, well, we are going to the states, we are going to the government officials everywhere in the world and say that if you, regulate us, just do not leave everything on the open and then criticize us for that. If there is a law, we will obey that law. So to Urška, I would like to ask, last year, your department at the Council of Europe, MSI-RES, produced a guidance note dealing with the prioritization of public interest content online. You also published recommendations on media pluralism and transparency of media ownership, promoting a favorable environment for quality journalism. So not everything is about moderating content on the regulation side, but the whole ecosystem and all the problems there. So what do you think as the most important steps to regulate global platforms in a way that improves the media ecosystem and encourages quality information, including accurate, in-depth news?
Hello, everyone. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. And this is a big question indeed. Sort of at the end, the regulators come and what do we do? Because indeed, it is the responsibilities are largely on the regulators to regulate. So what I can provide is perhaps some insights into the regulatory discussion and challenges in Europe, because I come from a European human rights organization, the Council of Europe. But I kind of hope that some of the answers might be relevant also across the board for what we're doing. Because in Europe right now, regulation of global platforms is a major policy issue. But of course, I mean, it is a very complex one, both as regards the market dimension and then the content dimension. And I'll focus on this latter one. And the informational power of platforms. And I have to start by saying that even in our small continent, there are noticeable differences between individual states' approaches to regulation, especially regulation of content. Obviously, on global scale, those differences are much bigger. So how to regulate in favor of quality news and information? It's a challenge. What we see is that it's a challenge also in established democracies where genuine attempts are underway right now to really achieve that, more quality news, more prominence for quality. But then in Europe and also amongst the membership of the Council of Europe, we have states which are experiencing media capture by political forces. We have states where pressures on independent media and also on platforms are something that is quite regular. And there is really no political will to even undertake such a task. Now, of course, for us, one way of at least partially overcoming this is a push by international organization that steer towards some sort of harmonized approaches to regulation across the continent. But of course, I mean, what we also try to do is two things: protect the widest possible scope of freedom of expression with our regulatory interventions, and ensure some basic conditions for free and safe and diverse media and communication environment. And so, yes, some of it can be achieved through rules for platforms, absolutely. But this is only one piece of a big puzzle. And some of our standards, also soon to be standards of the European Union, directly binding ones, focus on the conditions under which platforms should remove illegal content, such as hate speech, terrorist propaganda, etc., and also how they should deal with legal but harmful content. But that in itself does not really help to improve the media ecosystem. So for that, both the media and platforms need to be regulated in a way that facilitates production and dissemination of quality content. And for example, one piece of little puzzle of media regulation could be favorable tax policies that make it less costly for quality content to be produced. But this is, of course, one little piece. We have a lot more in the Council of Europe recommendations and standards to sort of inspire states and also the industry from. And then there is the question of how quality content is to reach the audience. So yes, it needs to be featured prominently on online platforms. And now if it's difficult to regulate illegal content, regulating for quality takes difficulties to a completely different level. And it raises a lot of questions such as, what is quality news? Who should decide what is quality? How can recommender systems, for example, or search engines be optimized for editorial values instead of commercial? And who will check that, or if anyone? How to ensure that quality will be rewarded with audience engagement? Now, some of these answers do come from the industry, indeed, and civil society, because platforms and the media are establishing their kind of regimes of prominence, which, if I put it very simply, I mean, that's about determining how apparent or how easily discoverable some content will be online. But these regimes can promote, of course, diverse and trustworthy news and information, obviously. It is important that, of course, media content is clearly attributed on platforms so that people can know the provenance of such content. But then in Europe, what we are starting to see is that some states are also starting to intervene in the prominence issues. And this is a bit of an alarm bell for us, to be quite honest. For now, it's about regulation of audiovisual content mostly, but of course, we wanted to provide also some principles for both states and platforms. And that's why we developed this guidance note on prioritization of public interest content. And if I just conclude with one thing that I think is really important to know about it, which is principles for states, they all go into directions of restricting state interventions to the very general level. Now, we do recognize, because this is really a very sensitive balancing act, that without some regulatory push, a lot of platforms would not be motivated to optimize for quality at all. But of course, governments should be prevented from deciding on any specific content that should or should not be made prominent. So maybe we can pick up on this later on.
Thank you. Yeah, now in the second half, we are already in the second half of this panel. And we can, I will turn to Alex because there is an audience question, and I will also give some brief background about this question regarding Turkey as well, because there are certain parallels. The question comes from the Philippines. I will ask that. But before that, I will ask another poll question to the audience. We have another poll. Do you agree with this statement? The viewers of this panel, please reply. Quality journalism is not merely a commodity. Platforms should give positive treatments to this type of content. So should there be like an affirmative action that boosts the reach of quality journalism, or as Urška said, public interest content in a more broader sense? So now the question comes from Carlos from the Philippines. I'm in the Philippines, and the son of a dictator just got elected president last May 10, thanks in large part to political disinformation and radicalization towards Marcos propaganda on YouTube. He says that YouTube will create a recommendation rabbit hole on pro-Marcos myths and propaganda instead of surfacing quality content like journalistic ones and fact checks. So he is asking, seeing the effects of this on fragile democracies like the Philippines, what is Google going to do moving forward vis-a-vis YouTube as a platform being used for political and societal disinformation? To complement this question, I will give an example from Turkey. We published last year the IPI Turkey Digital Media Report. You can find the link in the summary of this panel. A chapter was focused on search engine visibility of news outlets, and another chapter was focused on YouTube algorithm. And both of them show that Google's algorithms heavily favor the pro-government media, especially in the main search engines algorithms. 90%, more than 90% of Google's top story slots were given to the pro-government media outlets and their disinformation that actually risk fragile communities as well, including Jews in Turkey, including the LGBT minority in Turkey. Some very fringe, small pro-government newspapers are being boosted by Google's algorithm. Afterwards, and before that, we had been in contact with Google's executives as well, and having a really helpful dialogue between us. And on YouTube, just like in the Philippines, as Carlos said, the pro-government users are being kept in an echo chamber by YouTube's algorithm, while the more independent, those who consume the higher quality news content on YouTube are channeled again to the pro-government outlets as well by YouTube's algorithm, as we described there with data. What do you think about these two complaints from the people of the Philippines and Turkey regarding Google's various algorithms? Alex.
Sure, thanks for the question. I think maybe one thing that I didn't touch in on the first part, but relates to this question, is thinking about how do we ensure that we have systemic approaches to dealing with these issues so that when they come up, wherever they come up, we have sort of a roadmap for how we should be thinking about what the issues are and how we can address them. For us across platforms, this is true for YouTube, but also other Google products, we have an approach that's called the 4 Rs. And that's about, that is really based in thinking about how we remove content, how we raise content, reward, and reduce different types of content. And so those are sort of the principles for how we think about addressing these problems and how we tackle them. So the first is about what we remove, things that violate, for example, our community guidelines. Those things get removed as quickly as possible. And then the second piece, which relates to some of what both of you just raised, is about raising and how we raise up authoritative voices when people are looking for breaking news and information. Certainly we have metrics around how we think about that, but also there are tough questions that Urška raised, several of them. How do we decide what is quality and how do we know what that is in any given context? And so that is a perpetual kind of question or issue that we continue to tackle, and we must do as events arise in any given country and around elections, of course. The third piece is about rewarding. So where we have sort of like trust, in particular on YouTube, where there are trusted creators and artists, raising that up. And then lastly, it's about reducing the spread of content that brushes up against our policy guidelines. And so that really is about ensuring that content that might not violate our guidelines, but is close to the line, that it is not included in your recommendation, so that you may still continue to have access to it, but it wouldn't be recommended to you. And that, I'll say, is an important piece of how we think about the balancing rights-based interests in how we manage these issues, because it's important for us to not be taking things down that don't violate our policies, and to sort of ensure that they remain available to people so that they have a sense of what's going on in the world, what people are saying. But that doesn't mean that we should necessarily be recommending it to people and So that's like a really key piece, I think, in terms of maintaining sort of access to information and visibility of opinions while also not pushing them to people. So that is the kind of the broader approach that we take for how we think about these issues. I can't speak to any specific kind of channel on YouTube, but that's sort of the methodology that we have for thinking about the issues.
Could I speak up here?
Yeah, yes, please, Jeff.
Okay, I think what Alex is describing, these all seem like very good goals and the right way of thinking about these things. The thing that I am concerned with, and the same thing goes for the previous discussion about regulation and what it should look like. My concern is that having spent a lot of time with basically people who were in charge of actually combating these issues or dealing with these issues inside of Facebook, the capacity of Facebook and I think other platforms, and that would certainly include YouTube, it just simply isn't there to accomplish the things that people are talking about. Defining quality, as Alex referenced, is absolutely brutal. There have been, literally like treatises going back to, philosophers of various, like societies throughout history inside Facebook getting discussed about like sort of what does it mean to define quality. The second thing is that I think that we've kind of focused on disinformation, which is sort of like, I think we like to think about this as a very concrete problem. Most of the harm that Facebook is concerned about doesn't come from direct falsehoods necessarily. It comes from, radicalization and polarization and things that actually don't require falsehoods. If I want to, for example, like set up a blog devoted entirely to crimes committed by Jews, that can be entirely factual. It is also obviously inherently vile. And so that's a difficult thing. Also, the language by language work, right? I think this is something in terms of transparency I would love to know. What is Google's Turkish moderation staff like? And who is doing training of classifiers? And incidentally, of those classifiers, they're highly limited. The capacity to screen video is still very frontier. I basically just think that a lot of the things that we would like to see platforms do and that platforms say they wish to do are just simply out of the range of possibility right now. That these products have moved much faster than any of the technology that would be needed to provide even basic supervision.
Thank you, Jeff. And just a quick follow-up question to you, Jeff. Do you think that, for instance, the change of the leadership in those platforms can change anything, really, like the departure of, I don't know, Sheryl Sandberg now, or whether one day Mark Zuckerberg leaves Facebook, something fundamentally can change at Facebook? Or do you think that there is something inherently hard to manage in such big platforms?
I mean, certainly the latter. Look, the importance of leadership, it is there. I mean, I think that obviously having leaders who take these things seriously and not just talking about them, but actually being worried is important. But I think the way the platforms have developed, and I think Facebook is Meta is a particularly good example of this because of various product interacting groups and newsfeed and WhatsApp groups that get spun off from regular Facebook groups. It's hell. It is just like it's nearly impossible to deal with that complexity. So I don't think even the best of leadership, the wisest and most well-intentioned, could, with the existing sort of product suite and product design, kind of achieve the goals that it seems like people on this panel are talking about. So it feels to me like, I'm not saying that the capacity won't get there, but at least for right now, this is not a near-term thing that anyone could fix this in a concrete fashion.
Thank you. And by the way, the poll question, audience poll questions answer came. Quality journalism is not merely a commodity. Platforms should give positive treatment to this type of content. With this statement, 13 people agreed and 2 people disagreed with that. And Carlos said that, yes, it's the recommendation rabbit hole that's a big problem. So especially algorithms, what they recommend, what they suppress, and what they highlight is really important, it seems. And to Supriya, in this last 15 minutes, I would like to ask to Supriya and Urška about the remaining parts, especially in India. If we come to the solutions, like potential solutions, and as every one of us has got, like, we need to focus somewhere. These are so big issues. And if you pick just one thing, for instance, what is the most important platform for the Indian people to be informed as citizens, and to solve the most important issue with that platform, what would you suggest? Which platform and what solution?
That's an extremely difficult question. I mean, in India, Facebook has over 400 million users. WhatsApp and YouTube also have 500 million users. Increasingly, to me, it seems that YouTube really is the platform that we need to think about in India, and think about what its potential harms are, because there is sort of, especially in the last 2 years of the pandemic, YouTube has grown quite a lot. Even news has moved to YouTube to a point where just 2 days ago, there was a sort of video blogger who got arrested for something he said about a political leader in the country. So just to say that we're seeing increasingly people getting arrested for what they say on YouTube, which means that's a sign of how influential that platform is becoming for the public sphere in India. It's really, to me, it's kind of hard to say what is that one big thing that can help. But it does seem that YouTube, what we just discussed earlier as well, the algorithm keeps people locked in an echo chamber. So if you're getting radicalized, you're sort of exposed to Hindu supremacist groups which are spewing anti-Muslim propaganda, then there's a good chance you would just remain within that universe and you'd be served more and more of the same material. And I guess if there is a way to rethink engagement and algorithms and how they're contributing to the spread of hate in India through YouTube, I think that would be like a way forward. For a very long time, WhatsApp was something that was the center of conversation around disinformation in India. But I would say increasingly, to me, it seems YouTube is a place where a lot of public conversation is being said.
Thank you. And before we go to Urška, last audience poll question. Who is the most responsible side here? Who are the key actors when it comes to democratizing the algorithms for news? We have multiple choices. You can vote. 1, governments. 2, big tech companies. 3, the wider business world. 4, legacy media, all the newspapers, etc. 5, NGOs, civil society. 6, international and supranational organizations, including the EU, or individual voters, 7, or you can have your own answer as 8. And Urška, we will also like to Jeff and Alex too, as the last verse, we will come for solution. What can be the solution? Like for 2 minutes, you can summarize as your last verse. But Urška, please.
The solutions, yes, much more difficult than the questions and the considerations and the doubts. Okay, so we do try to provide solutions, but there is no silver bullet. So what we try to do is work in different areas. On the one hand, empower media and information literacy, for the users simply to be better equipped to navigate this entire world. Then to have, we do have some standards on human rights impacts of algorithms as well, and how they can be optimized for public values. But here I also need to agree with Jeff that it is a question of capacity as well. And the platforms do not by themselves have capacity to simply deal with all of these big questions. I would actually add a layer of difficulty to it, which is that platforms are global, but content regulations and considerations and problems are quite local. And very contextual. And we are dealing on the one hand, I mean, we see this in the Council of Europe very well. We see on the one hand with very developed democracies, where also governments are really ready to push for, you know, informed citizenry and quality. And then on the other hand, we're dealing with fragile democracies where there is a lot of the times very opaque dependencies, you know, between governments and some platforms, and we simply don't know what is going on. Anyway, access to data is another issue that is problematic. But in my view, in our view, actually, of our organization, there is a lot to be done through collaborative initiatives. And this is also what we're kind of pushing for. We know that the platforms are not necessarily equipped to define illegal content and much less to define quality content. But for that reason, there already are initiatives out there that are dealing with how to define quality content and perhaps how to define quality sources. In Europe, there is one called Journalism Trust Initiative, for example, and they've developed a standard actually and self-assessment tool whereby media outlets can then be certified as providing, if they, of course, you know, tick the boxes for transparency of editorial processes, transparency of ownership, etc., they can tick the boxes and be certified as providers of, let's say, a quality source at least. So for the platforms to work with such initiatives, I think that this can provide certain solutions, and these kind of quality verifications can be embedded then also in algorithms. For us, the international organizations, obviously what we will try to do is to follow the technological developments as best as we can, but this is difficult, and to try to accompany them by standards that then can be embedded in also some legislation, which again needs to be what we like to use as word proportionate. So not to overregulate, but to have targeted interventions where they're most needed.
Thank you. And Alex, your concluding remarks especially about solutions.
I guess I would, please.
Let's start with Alex and Jeff, then you, okay?
Yeah, my apologies very much.
No problem.
Sorry about that. I was going to say, it's tough to come after Urška because I think many of the things that you raised are many of the ways that we would say we are looking at solutions. That fundamentally there's a role, like every stakeholder has a role to play in figuring out how to improve on these challenges. Like it requires a whole of society approach. There is an important role for government, and I hope it is governments that have strong respect for human rights and rule of law, who take the leadership role in driving these conversations. And there's a role for international organizations, for journalism organizations, for tech companies, and for civil society, and many others to sort of, and I think that is importantly to the media literacy point as well, to really kind of continue to improve and invest in all of the ways we should do more and can do more. But and the ongoing challenge that the world is going to continue to change, and sort of increasingly the bad actors will always be more creative than us. And so for us to sort of, all of the stakeholder groups that take this seriously and want a rights respecting approach to combating disinformation and misinformation and lifting up quality journalism, to continue to engage with one another on the strategies and what we can do best. And it is important for companies and for Google and YouTube in particular to be hearing from all of you directly, and when there are things like the channel in the Philippines or the channel in Turkey, for us to hear about that and have a conversation so that we can kind of have a conversation internally and with you about how we are approaching it, and is the result one that we're that we all understand where we're landing and what the equities are, to kind of continue to inform the discussion as well.
Thank you. And we are finishing with Jeff, and there are two questions. We have 5 minutes left. Jeff, there are two questions for you. If you would like, you can answer while finishing with the solution proposals. When is Jeff's book coming out? One question is for you. And the second one is from Robin. He asks, Jeff, do you look at Reddit at all? I sent you an email about my website and how shadowy moderation might allow disinformation to grow. A similar moderation feature exists on Facebook where page managers can hide comments. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I think so. Both, I thought it's going to be a while. I wish I could. I wish I had a solid answer to that question yet, but hopefully next year. And in terms of sort of moderation tools, you know, I think that this is kind of an example of something where giving sort of group administrators more capacity to moderate content. I mean, this is assuming of obviously a functional community and a functional group. It's certainly a good step, and you know, it obviously, and it raises the question of sort of how features like this are always built in long after the initial product is built in, right? It's, you know, you build the thing first and then clean up the mess afterward has long been the approach. To sort of get to solutions, I wish I could say I was as optimistic as saying that like there was a near, you know, something in the near term that seemed like it was going to solve any of these problems. What seems really, you know, important right now is sort of mitigation. And I think if we're talking about sort of algorithms that you know, would perhaps enforce quality or not enforce, but it would support quality. The design of the systems used to sort of optimize and personalize content, literally the engineers of the companies themselves cannot tell you what they are doing and why at any particular point. They can study outcomes, sometimes they do, but we're sort of operating with things that are far more complex than our ability to oversee them is. And that was a trade that every successful platform made. And I think that, you know, the idea that sort of we could begin to even accomplish some of the things that people on this panel are talking about without thinking about simplification and a fairly radical simplification seems like it would be pretty daunting. You know, I'd say to say with a lot of respect to the people at Facebook whose work I've been able to look at, but you know, this is in its current form does not seem like a readily solvable problem. I think India in particular, which you know, is an extremely difficult one, in part given that all of the companies are under extensive pressure from the government. You know, former Facebook employee Sophie Zhang, you know, recently some Indian news outlets are writing about sort of her work, and I'd say it certainly dovetails with what I know to be the case, which is that you know, that Facebook at least had a very hard time challenging the ruling party, and I mean, given the pressure, which includes, you know, threats to throw employees in jail and so forth, it's understandable. But you know, but at the moment, it seems like what is the best response for a company like Facebook, given the presence of sort of IT cells, which are essentially near domestic troll farms in some instances, being prevalent from all parties in India, as best I am aware. This is really hard, and you know, it's not all the platform's fault, but the complexity sort of plays into the hands of bad actors, unfortunately. So I think just in their current configuration, it's really hard to see a good outcome. So sorry, I'm about that.
Thanks, Jeff. And we had asked who are the key actors when it comes to democratizing the algorithms for news, and those who responded, 63% of those who responded said that big tech companies had this responsibility, and 10%, around 10% said governments, and the other answers received less than 10% of votes. We have more questions from the audience, but unfortunately we need to end this session as we come to the end our time. So we thank very much to all the panelists and all the viewers here for this IPI hosted RightsCon panel. Thank you.